At 62 years old, I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. I'd been through a bitter divorce, watched friends turn their backs during my darkest hours, and survived the kind of workplace politics that could crush your spirit. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the moment my own daughter-in-law looked me in the eye at a family gathering and called me useless in front of everyone I cared about. What she didn't know was that I had just inherited my late sister's life insurance money. What she definitely didn't expect was that by the end of that week, I would cancel all babysitting duties, book a 6-month Mediterranean cruise, and leave her scrambling to figure out how useless I really was. This is the story of how one cruel word changed everything, and why sometimes the best revenge is simply living your best life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dorothy Henderson had always been an early riser, a habit formed during 35 years of marriage to Robert, who owned a small plumbing business and needed to be on job sites before most people had their first cup of coffee. Now, 3 years after his sudden heart attack at 59, she still woke at 5:30 a.m., though the house in suburban Phoenix no longer held the purposeful energy of a working man's morning routine. Instead, it carried different sounds: the patter of small feet on hardwood floors, the whispered conversations of parents trying not to wake sleeping children, and the constant hum of a household that had somehow reorganized itself around her schedule, without anyone explicitly asking if that was what she wanted. Dot moved through her kitchen with the measured precision of someone who had prepared thousands of breakfasts, but these days, the routine felt different. Where she had once cooked for Robert and their son Marcus, she now found herself preparing meals for Marcus, his wife Stephanie, and their twin 4-year-olds, Lily and Mason. The kitchen countertops bore the accumulated wear of decades of family life, but they were clean and organized with the care of someone who understood that maintaining order was sometimes the only control you had left. The morning light filtered through the sage green curtains she'd sewn herself in 2018, casting familiar shadows across the limestone tile that Robert had insisted on installing despite the extra cost. "It'll last forever, Dot," he'd said, running his hands over the smooth surface. "Long after we're gone, this kitchen will still be beautiful." He'd been wrong about many things, but not about the durability of good materials. The coffee maker gurgled to life, and Dot reached automatically for the cabinet where Robert's favorite mug had once lived. A simple white ceramic cup with "World's Best Dad" printed in blue letters that Marcus had given him for Father's Day in 2015. Her fingers closed around empty air, and she remembered that Stephanie had accidentally broken it 6 months ago, while reorganizing the kitchen cabinets to make room for her collection of matching stoneware sets. "It was just sitting there looking so old and chipped," Stephanie had explained with the casual dismissiveness that had become her trademark when dealing with Dot's possessions. "I figured you'd want to upgrade to something more modern anyway." Dot had said nothing at the time, just swept up the pieces and thrown them away while Stephanie continued rearranging her kitchen as if it were her own. It was easier than arguing, easier than pointing out that some things couldn't be replaced simply because they looked worn. Some things held value that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with memory. She opened the cabinet fully now, moving aside the expensive stoneware that Stephanie had gradually introduced to replace Dot's everyday dishes. Everything matched perfectly, all cream-colored perfection that photographed beautifully for Stephanie's social media posts about family life in our gorgeous kitchen. The posts that somehow never mentioned whose kitchen it actually was. The sound of small feet on the stairs announced the arrival of the twins, and Dot smiled genuinely as Lily and Mason appeared in the doorway wearing matching dinosaur pajamas. At 4 years old, they possessed the unconscious honesty that made them both delightful and occasionally devastating companions. "Good morning, Grandma Dot," Lily said, climbing onto one of the kitchen stools with the determined effort of someone still mastering the coordination required for such maneuvers. "Mommy said you might make pancakes today." "Did she now?" Dot reached for the pancake mix, though Stephanie had never actually asked her to make breakfast. It was simply assumed now. Another item on the unspoken list of services that Dot provided in her own home. The babysitting, the cooking, the cleaning up after family meals that she hadn't been consulted about planning. Mason nodded vigorously, syrup already on his mind. "She said you like making breakfast for us, because it makes you feel useful." The words hit Dot like a physical blow, though she kept her expression neutral for the children's sake. Useful. As if her contributions to this household were therapeutic activities designed to give her a sense of purpose, rather than actual services that saved the family thousands of dollars in childcare and domestic help. "Well then," Dot said, forcing lightness into her voice, "I suppose I'd better get started." The kitchen filled with the familiar sounds of morning preparation, the whisk against the bowl, the gentle sizzle of butter in the pan, the twins' chatter about their upcoming day at preschool. Dot listened with genuine attention, storing away details about their activities and friendships that she would remember long after their parents had forgotten them. This was her gift, and, increasingly, her burden. She paid attention in a world that had grown distracted by screens and schedules, and the constant pressure to document every moment rather than simply live it. "Are you guys ready for, oh?" Stephanie appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting when she saw Dot at the stove. She wore the kind of athleisure outfit that cost more than Dot spent on groceries in a month, her blonde hair pulled back in the effortlessly messy style that required 45 minutes and 3 different products to achieve. Her makeup was applied with the precision of someone who knew she would be photographed throughout the day, even if only by herself for social media content. "I was going to make them cereal," Stephanie said, her tone carrying the slight edge it acquired whenever she found Dot doing something she'd planned to do herself. It was the voice of someone who felt perpetually upstaged by a woman whose only crime was anticipating needs and meeting them efficiently. "The pancakes are almost ready," Dot replied evenly, flipping a golden circle in the pan. The kitchen was large enough for both women to work comfortably, but somehow Stephanie's presence always made it feel cramped, as if there wasn't room for 2 people who both considered themselves responsible for the household's smooth operation. "Lily, Mason, go wash your hands for breakfast," Stephanie directed, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when establishing her position as the children's primary authority figure. It was unnecessary. The children would have washed their hands without prompting, but it served to remind everyone present of the hierarchy that Stephanie was constantly working to maintain. As the twins scampered toward the downstairs bathroom, Stephanie moved to the coffee pot, pouring herself a cup into one of her cream-colored mugs. The movements were deliberate, territorial, the actions of someone marking their space in a kitchen that had been Dot's domain for 28 years. "We really should establish more consistent routines around breakfast," Stephanie said, not quite looking at Dot. "The children need structure, and it's confusing for them when expectations keep changing." Dot nodded, though she wasn't certain what could be more consistent than pancakes every Tuesday for the past year. Structure, she had learned, was Stephanie's favorite word when she wanted to implement changes without appearing to criticize existing arrangements. It was a diplomatic way of saying that whatever Dot was doing wasn't quite right, even when it was working perfectly well. "I found something interesting yesterday," Dot said quietly, testing the waters for a conversation that had been building in her mind for weeks. "My sister Linda's life insurance finally came through." Stephanie's hand stilled on the coffee cup handle. Linda had passed away 4 months ago after a brief illness, and her financial affairs had been tied up in probate until recently. Dot hadn't mentioned the inheritance to anyone, partly because she was still processing her own grief, and partly because she'd learned to be cautious about sharing financial information in a household where money seemed to create more problems than it solved. "That's nice," Stephanie said carefully. "Was it a significant amount?" The question was posed with studied casualness, but Dot could hear the calculation behind it. Stephanie's mind was already working through the possibilities: home improvements, family vacations, college funds for the twins. Resources that could benefit the family unit that had somehow expanded to include Dot's financial obligations without explicitly including her decision-making authority. "Enough to change some things," Dot replied, deliberately vague. The actual amount, $180,000 after taxes, represented more freedom than she'd possessed since Robert's death had left her financially comfortable but not independently wealthy. It was enough to travel, to make choices based on preference rather than necessity, to remember what it felt like to prioritize her own desires rather than constantly accommodating everyone else's needs. The pancake on the griddle began to brown around the edges, and Dot flipped it with the automatic precision of someone who had mastered the timing years ago. The kitchen fell into the comfortable silence that often settled between them when conversation ventured into potentially complicated territory. Both women had learned to navigate around topics that might lead to conflict, though the effort required to maintain peace was beginning to feel exhausting rather than harmonious. Marcus appeared in the doorway, already dressed in the khaki pants and polo shirt that comprised his uniform as a middle school math teacher. At 34, he retained the earnest expression that had made him popular with students and parents alike, though there were new lines around his eyes that spoke to the stress of managing a household with two strong-willed women who rarely agreed on anything. "Morning, Mom," he said, kissing Dot's cheek with the automatic affection of habit. The gesture was genuine but brief, part of the morning choreography that kept the household running smoothly. He moved to Stephanie next, wrapping his arms around her waist and kissing her neck in a display of marital affection that seemed calculated to remind everyone present of their primary allegiance to each other. "You're up early," Stephanie said, though this wasn't true. Marcus rose at the same time every weekday, leaving for school with the punctuality that had been drilled into him during his childhood in this same house. "Parent-teacher conferences start today," Marcus replied, pouring coffee into a travel mug emblazoned with the school district logo. "I'll probably be there until 7 or 8 tonight." He surveyed the kitchen scene, his wife's efficient preparation for the day, his children eating breakfast, his mother cleaning the griddle, and seemed to find nothing amiss in the choreography of their morning routine. This was Marcus's greatest strength and most significant weakness, his ability to maintain equilibrium by avoiding the undercurrents that threatened domestic peace. "Don't wait up," he said, kissing both women goodbye with the same casual affection. The gesture that had once felt natural now highlighted the delicate balance he was trying to maintain between the two most important women in his life, neither of whom felt particularly supported by his diplomatic approach to household management. The twins returned from washing their hands and climbed onto their stools, attacking their pancakes with the focused intensity that 4-year-olds brought to preferred foods. Dot watched them eat, noting the syrup on Mason's chin and the way Lily carefully cut her pancakes into perfect squares before taking each bite. These details felt precious in a way that made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Grandma Dot," Lily said around a mouthful of pancake, "are you coming to our school play next Friday?" "Of course, sweetheart," Dot replied automatically, though she realized she had no idea what time the play was scheduled or whether anyone had thought to include her in the planning. Information about the children's activities flowed through Stephanie, who maintained control over the family calendar with the efficiency of an executive assistant managing a complicated schedule. "Actually," Stephanie interjected, "the play is at 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, during school hours." She paused, her tone taking on the patient quality she used when explaining complicated adult concepts to children. "Grandma Dot might not be able to make it because she has her own activities during the day." The statement was technically accurate. Dot did have activities during the day, including the volunteer work at the animal shelter that she'd maintained for 15 years. But it was delivered in a way that made her sound like a social butterfly too busy with her own pursuits to prioritize her grandchildren's important events. "I can rearrange my schedule," Dot said quickly, not wanting the children to feel disappointed. "The shelter can manage without me for one afternoon." "Are you sure?" Stephanie's concern sounded genuine, but there was something underneath it that felt like a test. "I know how important your volunteer work is to you. We wouldn't want you to sacrifice something meaningful just to watch a 15-minute preschool performance." The words stung in a way that Stephanie probably intended. By framing Dot's attendance as a sacrifice rather than a priority, she managed to diminish both the importance of the children's event and Dot's desire to be present for it. It was a masterful example of the subtle undermining that had become Stephanie's specialty: criticism disguised as consideration, boundaries established through apparent concern for Dot's well-being. "It's not a sacrifice," Dot said firmly. "Watching my grandchildren perform is exactly where I want to be." Stephanie smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Well, if you're absolutely certain you can make it work with your busy schedule. The breakfast dishes were cleared with the efficient choreography that characterized their morning routine, each person playing their assigned role in the domestic theater that kept the household functioning. Stephanie packed lunches with military precision while consulting her phone for updates on her personal training clients. Marcus gathered his teaching materials and kissed everyone goodbye with the distracted affection of someone whose mind was already focused on the workday ahead. The twins finished their breakfast and ran upstairs to brush their teeth, their voices echoing through the house as they negotiated the bathroom routine that required constant supervision. Dot loaded the dishwasher and wiped down the counters, her movements automatic after decades of kitchen cleanup. But as she worked, her mind wandered to the inheritance money sitting in her bank account, earning minimal interest while she tried to decide how to use this unexpected windfall. For months, she had been considering possibilities: home improvements that would make the house more comfortable for everyone, a college fund for the twins, perhaps a family vacation that would create lasting memories. All of her ideas had centered around ways to benefit the people she loved, the family that had become her primary source of purpose since Robert's death. But Stephanie's comment about her busy schedule lingered in her mind, along with Mason's innocent repetition of his mother's words about feeling useful. The inheritance represented something more than money. It represented choice, independence, the possibility of prioritizing her own needs for the first time in years. The house settled into the quiet that followed the morning exodus. But instead of the peaceful solitude she usually treasured, Dot felt restless. She moved through rooms that contained her furniture, her photographs, her lifetime of accumulated possessions, but increasingly felt like spaces she maintained, rather than truly inhabited. The living room held the sectional sofa that Stephanie had suggested they purchase last year to quote, create better flow for family gatherings. It was comfortable and practical, but it had required moving Robert's favorite recliner to the basement to make room. The walls displayed family photographs that Stephanie had reorganized into gallery walls that looked professional but somehow made individual pictures less meaningful. The coffee table held Stephanie's collection of decorative books about interior design and wellness, volumes that looked beautiful but had never been opened. None of these changes had been dramatic enough to protest individually. Each adjustment had been presented as an improvement, a modernization that would benefit everyone. But the cumulative effect was that Dot felt like a guest in her own home, politely accommodating the preferences of people who had gradually assumed authority over spaces she had created and maintained for nearly 3 decades. She settled into the kitchen nook where she paid bills and managed household correspondence, surrounded by the organized chaos of family life. School permission slips requiring signatures, medical forms that needed updating, appointment reminders for activities she had volunteered to coordinate but hadn't been consulted about scheduling. The inheritance paperwork sat in a manila folder, official documents that represented Linda's final gift to the sister who had cared for her during her illness and managed her estate after her death. Linda had been 5 years older than Dot, never married, fiercely independent until the cancer that had taken her with devastating swiftness. They had been close but not sentimental, practical women who expressed love through action rather than words. "Take care of yourself first for once," Linda had said during one of their last conversations. "You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Promise me you'll do something just for Dot." At the time, Dot had dismissed the advice as the rambling of someone weakened by chemotherapy and pain medication. But now, sitting in her kitchen that no longer felt entirely like her own, Linda's words carried new weight. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was permission to choose differently, to prioritize her own needs without guilt or extensive justification. Dot opened her laptop and began browsing travel websites. Something she hadn't done since Robert's death had made solitary vacations feel too lonely to contemplate. But the inheritance changed the mathematics of independence. Suddenly, extended travel wasn't a luxury requiring careful budgeting. It was a possibility limited only by her own willingness to prioritize her desires over her obligations. The Mediterranean cruise itineraries were particularly appealing. 6 months of exploring ports from Barcelona to Istanbul, small ship luxury with educational programs and cultural immersion. The cost was significant but not prohibitive given her new financial situation. More importantly, It represented the kind of adventure that Robert had always promised they would take, someday when we have more time. Someday had never arrived for Robert, but it was available to her now if she had the courage to claim it. The front door opened and closed, announcing Stephanie's return from dropping the twins at preschool. Her voice carried from the entryway as she spoke into her phone, coordinating training sessions with clients who paid premium rates for the privilege of working out with a former college athlete who had maintained her competitive edge through motherhood. "No, Thursday at 10 works perfectly," Stephanie was saying as she entered the kitchen. "I'll have complete focus because my mother-in-law will be watching the kids all day." She paused, listening to her client's response. "Oh, she loves it. It gives her something to do, you know. Keeps her feeling useful and involved." There was that word again, useful. As if Dot's contributions to their household were charity work designed to give her a sense of purpose, rather than actual services that enabled Stephanie's career and lifestyle. As if the woman who had raised Marcus, maintained this house for 3 decades, and provided free childcare for 4 years was lucky to be included in family activities rather than essential to their success. Dot closed the laptop quietly and listened as Stephanie continued her conversation, making plans that assumed Dot's availability without consulting her preferences or acknowledging that she might have her own agenda for Thursday. The assumption of free labor, the casual dismissal of her autonomy, the reduction of her identity to useful, it all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. Linda's inheritance wasn't just money, it was freedom. And freedom, Dot was beginning to realize, might require her to disappoint some people who had grown far too comfortable with her unconditional availability. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The following Tuesday morning brought an unexpected phone call that would shift the delicate balance of Dot's household in ways she couldn't have anticipated. She was finishing her second cup of coffee, reading the newspaper in the blessed quiet that followed the morning exodus, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Sarah Martinez from Sunshine Preschool. I'm calling about Lillian Mason's pickup arrangements for this afternoon." Dot felt a familiar flutter of confusion mixed with irritation. "I'm sorry, what about the pickup arrangements?" "Well, your daughter-in-law called this morning to add you to the authorized pickup list for today. She said you'd be collecting the children at 3 o'clock instead of her usual time. I just wanted to confirm the change with you directly since it's school policy to verify with all parties when arrangements are modified." The words settled over Dot like a lead blanket. Stephanie had volunteered her for childcare duty without consultation, then handled the logistics as if Dot's agreement was a foregone conclusion. It was a small thing, really, picking up the grandchildren she adored from a school that was only 15 minutes away. But the assumption behind it, the casual commandeering of her afternoon, without even the courtesy of a phone call, felt like a violation of basic respect. "Of course," Dot heard herself saying, because disappointing the school administrator and potentially creating confusion for the children felt worse than enabling Stephanie's presumptuous behavior. 3 o'clock pickup, I'll be there." After hanging up, Dot sat staring at her phone, processing the implications of what had just occurred. She had volunteered at the animal shelter on Tuesday afternoons for 15 years. The director, Janet Walsh, was expecting her at 2:30 to help with the new intake of rescue cats that had arrived over the weekend. 3 elderly felines that had been surrendered by their owner's family after she moved to assisted living, animals that needed gentle handling and patient socialization to prepare them for adoption. Dot called the shelter immediately, her voice tight with frustration she couldn't quite mask. "Janet, it's Dot. I'm so sorry, but I need to cancel this afternoon. Family emergency." "Oh no, I hope everything's all right," Janet replied, her concern genuine. Janet was 68 herself, a widow who understood the complicated dynamics of family obligations that could shift without warning. "It's fine, just a scheduling conflict that came up at the last minute." Dot couldn't bring herself to explain that her own daughter-in-law had unilaterally rearranged her day without consultation. It felt too petty to voice, yet too significant to dismiss. "The cats will be fine until Thursday," Janet assured her. "Marmalade has been hiding in his kennel anyway. He probably needs another day to decompress before we start working with him." After hanging up, Dot remained at the kitchen table, staring at the newspaper she was no longer reading. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Stephanie made decisions about Dot's time and availability with the casual assumption that her own priorities automatically took precedence. The preschool pickup was just the latest example in a series of incidents that individually seemed too minor to address, but collectively represented a fundamental disrespect for Dot's autonomy. Last month, Stephanie had volunteered Dot to make 36 cupcakes for the preschool's fall festival without asking first. 2 weeks ago, she'd scheduled a playdate at Dot's house for Thursday afternoon, texting the other mothers that Grandma Dot loves hosting the kids before mentioning it to Dot. Just last week, she'd promised Marcus's colleague that Dot would watch their 6-year-old son during a Saturday evening dinner party because, quote, "she's always available and she loves children." All of these assumptions were technically accurate. Dot did love hosting children, she was generally available, and she had never explicitly refused any of these requests. But the pattern revealed something troubling about how Stephanie viewed her role in the family, not as an equal adult with her own preferences and obligations, but as a resource to be deployed when convenient. The morning stretched ahead of her now, reorganized around responsibilities she hadn't chosen but couldn't refuse without seeming unreasonable. Dot found herself walking through her house with fresh eyes, noticing details that had gradually shifted over the 4 years since Stephanie and Marcus had moved in temporarily, while they saved for a house of their own. The living room bookshelf now held Stephanie's collection of wellness and parenting guides prominently displayed, while Dot's mystery novels and gardening books had been relocated to less visible shelves. The coffee table featured Stephanie's decorative ceramic bowls filled with carefully arranged succulents, replacing the simple wooden bowl where Dot had always kept her reading glasses and current magazine. Even the refrigerator door had been transformed into a gallery of the twins' artwork, and Stephanie's inspirational quotes printed on expensive cardstock. None of these changes had been dramatic or unreasonable. Stephanie had a good eye for design, and her organizational skills had undoubtedly improved the house's functionality. But the cumulative effect was that Dot felt like she was living in a beautifully curated space that happened to contain her possessions, rather than a home that reflected her personality and preferences. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom, the one space that remained entirely hers, and opened the laptop she'd been using to research travel options. The Mediterranean cruise itinerary filled the screen. 6 months of freedom, exploration, and the luxury of making decisions based solely on her own desires. The departure date was November 15th, just 6 weeks away. Close enough to be real, far enough to allow for proper planning. Dot had traveled extensively with Robert during their marriage. Weekend trips to national parks, anniversary vacations to coastal cities, the occasional week-long cruise that had left them both craving more time to truly relax and explore. But those trips had been collaborative efforts, planned around Robert's work schedule and their joint preferences for familiar comforts over adventurous exploration. This would be different. Solo travel on a small luxury ship with educational programming and cultural immersion opportunities. The kind of intellectually stimulating experience that Robert had always found too complicated, but that appealed to Dot's curiosity about history, art, and cultures beyond her suburban Phoenix experience. The cost was substantial. $45,000 for a deluxe balcony suite for 6 months, but well within her means given Linda's inheritance. More importantly, it represented a fundamental choice: spend the money on experiences that enriched her own life, or continue saving it for family improvements and future security that might never come. "Take care of yourself first for once," Linda had urged during one of their last conversations. At the time, Dot had protested that she was fine, that family came first, that self-indulgence was a luxury she'd never been comfortable embracing. But sitting in her bedroom, surrounded by evidence of how completely her identity had merged with her family responsibilities, Linda's advice felt less like selfishness and more like survival. The phone rang again, interrupting her contemplation. Marcus's voice carried the harried quality it acquired when he was trying to manage multiple obligations simultaneously. Mom, huge favor to ask. Stephanie's got a new client consultation this afternoon that could be really lucrative, but it conflicts with picking up the kids. Could you possibly? I'm already picking them up, Dot interrupted, her voice sharper than she'd intended. Stephanie called the school this morning and added me to the pickup list without asking me first. The silence that followed stretched long enough for Dot to hear the uncomfortable recognition in Marcus's pause. He was an intelligent man, a good teacher, who understood the dynamics of respect and communication in his professional life. The fact that he couldn't immediately defend his wife's behavior suggested that he recognized the problem, even if he'd been avoiding addressing it. I'm sorry, Mom. That wasn't right. Stephanie should have asked you first. Yes, she should have, Dot agreed, feeling a small surge of validation at his acknowledgement. I had to cancel my volunteer work at the shelter to accommodate a schedule change I wasn't consulted about. I'll talk to her, Marcus promised, though they both knew that conversations about Stephanie's presumptuous behavior rarely led to lasting changes. It won't happen again. But Dot was no longer interested in promises about future behavior. The pattern was too well established, the assumptions too deeply ingrained. Marcus, I've been thinking about taking some extended time for myself. Maybe traveling for a while. That sounds great, Mom. You deserve a vacation. When were you thinking? Maybe we could plan something around my spring break so the whole family could. No, Dot said firmly. I mean traveling alone. For several months, starting in November. The silence returned, longer this time, weighted with implications that neither of them wanted to address directly. Marcus was calculating the impact of Dot's absence on their carefully structured household arrangements, the childcare and domestic support that enabled his and Stephanie's careers and lifestyle. Several months? He repeated carefully. That's a long time to be away from the kids. It is, Dot agreed, but I think it might be exactly what I need. What about? We'd have to figure out new arrangements for pickup and babysitting and… There it was, the automatic assumption that Dot's travel plans needed to be evaluated based on their impact on everyone else's convenience rather than her own desires and well-being. The reduction of her autonomy to a logistical problem that required solving rather than a personal choice that deserved support. You'd figure it out, Dot said simply. Families manage childcare all the time without live-in grandparents. It's really quite common. After hanging up, Dot sat with the weight of what she'd just initiated. The conversation with Marcus had been a test, a way of measuring how her family would respond to the possibility of her unavailability. His reaction, immediate concern about logistics rather than excitement for her opportunity, confirmed what she'd been gradually acknowledging. Her value to this family was primarily functional rather than emotional. The realization hurt, but it also clarified her thinking in a way that months of accumulated resentment hadn't managed to accomplish. She wasn't just considering travel because she wanted to see the Mediterranean. She was considering it because she needed to rediscover who she was beyond the roles of babysitter, household manager, and emotional support system for people who had forgotten to consider her needs. The afternoon pickup at Sunshine Preschool proceeded exactly as Dot had expected. Lily and Mason were delighted to see her, chattering excitedly about their day as they climbed into her car, with the easy affection that made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. But their innocent questions revealed the casual way their parents discussed her availability and obligations. Mommy said you love picking us up because it gives you something fun to do, Lily announced as Dot buckled her seatbelt. She said grown-ups need jobs to feel important. Mason nodded seriously. Daddy said you're really good at helping families because you don't have your own work to worry about. The children's repetition of adult conversations wasn't malicious. 4-year-olds simply reported what they heard without understanding the implications. But their innocent words revealed how completely Stephanie and Marcus had reframed Dot's contributions to their household. Her childcare wasn't a generous gift from a loving grandmother. It was recreational activity that benefited her as much as them. Her availability wasn't a sacrifice of her own time and energy. It was the natural result of having no other meaningful obligations. The drive home was filled with the twins' chatter about their day, their friends, their excitement about the upcoming school play. Dot listened with genuine attention while processing the growing awareness that her family's perception of her role had fundamentally shifted without her consent or participation. Somewhere along the way, she had been redefined from an autonomous adult who chose to help her family to a resource that existed primarily to facilitate everyone else's convenience. Back at the house, Dot prepared snacks for the children and settled them with books and quiet toys while she considered her next steps. The Mediterranean cruise brochure lay open on the kitchen counter, its glossy photographs of ancient ports and luxury amenities representing possibilities that felt both exciting and terrifying. Traveling alone for 6 months would require courage she wasn't certain she possessed. She'd never made a major decision without consulting Robert first, then Marcus, then the whole family unit that had gradually assumed authority over her choices. But Linda's inheritance had provided more than financial resources. It had offered permission to prioritize her own desires for the first time in decades. The front door opened at 4:30, announcing Stephanie's return from her client consultation. She entered the kitchen with the energy of someone whose day had gone exactly according to plan, her workout clothes and professional demeanor suggesting a successful meeting with someone willing to pay premium rates for her expertise. "Thank you so much for getting the kids," Stephanie said, kissing each twin and accepting their excited reports about their afternoon with Grandma Dot. "The client meeting was amazing. She wants to train 3 times a week, and she's perfectly flexible with scheduling since she works from home." Dot noticed that Stephanie's gratitude was directed toward her successful afternoon rather than acknowledgement of the inconvenience she'd caused by changing Dot's schedule without consultation. It was a subtle but significant difference, one that reinforced the pattern of treating Dot's time as infinitely flexible rather than genuinely valuable. "I had to cancel my volunteer work at the shelter," Dot said quietly, watching Stephanie's face for signs that she understood the impact of her presumptuous scheduling. "Oh, I'm sure they managed fine without you," Stephanie replied briskly, already moving on to organize the children's backpacks and prepare for the evening routine. "Those kinds of volunteer jobs are really flexible, aren't they? That's what makes them perfect for people who have the time to help out when needed." The dismissal was complete and devastating. 15 years of dedicated service to animals in need, relationships with fellow volunteers who depended on her consistency, the carefully structured program that helped elderly pets transition to new homes, all of it reduced to those kinds of volunteer jobs that existed primarily to give people like Dot something to do with their abundant free time. Standing in her own kitchen, watching her daughter-in-law reorganize her grandchildren's possessions with the efficient authority of someone who had never questioned her right to make such decisions, Dot felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger, exactly, but a crystal-clear recognition that her family's perception of her value was fundamentally incompatible with her own sense of dignity and worth. The Mediterranean cruise suddenly felt less like an indulgence and more like a necessity. 6 months away from assumptions about her availability, from casual dismissals of her other obligations, from the gradual erosion of respect that had left her feeling like a convenient resource rather than a beloved family member. That evening, after Marcus returned from his parent-teacher conferences and the family settled into their nighttime routines, Dot made a decision that would change everything. She opened her laptop, navigated to the cruise line's website, and began the booking process for 6 months of freedom that would begin in exactly 6 weeks. The deposit was substantial, $5,000 to hold her deluxe balcony suite, but clicking the Confirm Reservation button felt like reclaiming something essential that she'd lost without realizing it was gone. Her autonomy. Her right to make choices based on her own desires rather than everyone else's convenience. Her identity as a complete person rather than a useful appendage to other people's lives. Tomorrow, she would tell them about the cruise. But tonight, she sat in her bedroom with the confirmation email displayed on her screen, feeling more excited about the future than she had since Robert's death had left her searching for purpose in a world that had gradually redefined her as a resource rather than a person. The Mediterranean was calling, and for the first time in years, Dot was ready to answer. Dot woke the next morning with the strange sensation of having crossed an invisible line in the night. The cruise confirmation email sat in her inbox like a secret that changed everything, even though nothing in her physical environment had shifted. The kitchen still held the familiar sense of coffee and morning light, but her relationship to this space, to this life, had fundamentally altered with a few clicks of a mouse and a credit card number. She moved through her morning routine with unusual deliberation, aware that each action might be one of the last times she performed these tasks for 6 months. making coffee in the machine that Robert had insisted on buying 3 years before his death. Reading the Phoenix Republic at the kitchen table, where she'd processed decades of family news, both joyful and devastating. Watching the Arizona sunrise paint the desert mountains in shades of coral and gold that she'd admired for 28 years but had somehow stopped noticing in recent months. The house was quieter than usual. Marcus had left early for a faculty meeting, and Stephanie was upstairs getting the twins ready for preschool, with the kind of extended preparation that suggested she planned to use the school drop-off as an opportunity for social networking with other mothers. Dot could hear water running, voices calling instructions about teeth brushing and shoe location, the ordinary chaos of family mornings that she had been supporting but not truly participating in. At 8:30, Stephanie appeared in the kitchen with Lily and Mason, both children dressed in coordinated outfits that had been photographed and posted to social media before they'd finished breakfast. The twins kissed Dot goodbye with their usual enthusiasm, promising to tell her about their day when they returned home. Stephanie gathered her keys and oversized designer bag, with the efficient movements of someone whose schedule was carefully orchestrated around maximizing productivity and social opportunities. "I'll be back around 11, Stephanie announced, already mentally organizing her morning. "I'm meeting Rebecca Chen for coffee after drop-off. She's thinking about adding personal training to her wellness routine, and her husband's a cardiologist who could be great for referrals." She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. "Could you possibly start a load of the kids' laundry? They're almost out of school clothes." The request was phrased politely, but it carried the automatic assumption that Dot would handle domestic tasks that Stephanie hadn't found time to complete. Another small addition to the invisible job description that had evolved around Dot's presence in the household: unofficial housekeeper, unpaid childcare provider, general facilitator of everyone else's convenience. "Actually," Dot said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal, "I need to talk with you and Marcus tonight about some changes I'm planning. Important changes that will affect the household schedule." Stephanie's expression shifted from distracted efficiency to sharp attention. In 4 years of living together, Dot had never announced important changes or demanded family meetings. She had been the stable constant around which everyone else's needs and schedules revolved. "What kind of changes?" Stephanie asked, her voice carrying the cautious tone people used when they sensed that comfortable assumptions were about to be challenged. "Travel plans," Dot replied simply. "Extended travel plans that will require some adjustments to current arrangements." She could see Stephanie's mind working through the implications, calculating the impact of Dot's temporary absence on the carefully structured system that enabled her career and lifestyle. A weekend trip would be manageable, perhaps even a week-long vacation. But extended travel suggested something more disruptive, something that would require fundamental reorganization rather than minor adjustments. "How extended?" Stephanie asked, her meeting with Rebecca Chen clearly forgotten as she processed this unexpected development. 6 months, Dot said, watching Stephanie's face carefully. "Starting in November." The silence that followed stretched long enough for both women to understand that this wasn't a discussion about vacation planning. This was an announcement about the unraveling of assumptions that had governed their shared life for 4 years. Stephanie's carefully organized schedule, her growing business, her reliance on free childcare and domestic support, all of it suddenly required reconsideration. 6 months? Stephanie repeated, her voice climbing toward the pitch it acquired when she was genuinely upset rather than diplomatically irritated. "You're talking about leaving for 6 months? What about the children? What about your responsibilities here?" The word responsibilities hung in the air between them, loaded with assumptions about Dot's obligations that had never been explicitly negotiated or agreed upon. Responsibilities that had somehow evolved from voluntary assistance to expected duties without anyone acknowledging the transition. "My responsibilities," Dot said carefully, "are to live my life in a way that brings me joy and fulfillment. At 62, I've earned the right to prioritize my own needs occasionally." Stephanie's face cycled through emotions: shock, anger, calculation, and something that looked like genuine panic as she contemplated the logistical nightmare of managing her business and family obligations without the safety net that Dot's presence provided. But this is so sudden, Stephanie protested. We would need time to make arrangements, to find alternative childcare, to reorganize everything. You can't just decide something this major without consulting the family whose lives will be affected. The irony was breathtaking. Stephanie, who had spent 4 years making unilateral decisions about Dot's time and availability, was now demanding consultation about choices that would inconvenience her. The same woman who had volunteered Dot for preschool pickup without asking was outraged that Dot might make travel plans without seeking her approval. I'm consulting you now, Dot replied evenly. I'm giving you 6 weeks' notice, which is more consideration than I typically receive when my schedule gets rearranged to accommodate family needs. The reference to Stephanie's presumptuous behavior landed exactly as Dot had intended. Stephanie's face flushed with the uncomfortable recognition that her own actions were being held up as a mirror, reflecting the casual disrespect that had become normalized in their household. That's completely different, Stephanie said quickly. Those are minor schedule adjustments to help the family function. This is abandoning your responsibilities when we need you most. Abandoning? Dot's voice sharpened. I'm taking a vacation, Stephanie. Something that millions of people do, without it being characterized as abandonment of their families. But even as she said it, Dot understood that Stephanie's reaction revealed something fundamental about how her role in the family had been conceptualized. She wasn't viewed as an independent adult who chose to help her family. She was seen as a resource whose primary obligation was maintaining everyone else's convenience. Her desires and needs had become secondary to her function as unpaid domestic support. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Marcus, returning unexpectedly early from his faculty meeting. Stephanie and Dot looked toward the window, both recognizing that the discussion they'd been having would now need to include the person whose position as mediator between them had become increasingly untenable. Marcus entered through the kitchen door with the distracted energy of someone whose workday had been disrupted by administrative complications. He kissed Stephanie automatically, then noticed the tension radiating from both women with the recognition of someone who had become expert at reading the emotional weather in his household. Everything okay? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer was no. Your mother has decided to abandon us for 6 months, Stephanie said, her choice of words revealing the depth of her agitation. She's planning some kind of extended vacation starting in November, and she seems to think we can just figure out childcare and household management without any input from her about how that might actually work. Marcus looked between the two women, his expression cycling through confusion, concern, and the weary recognition that he was about to be asked to solve a problem that had no easy solutions. This was his least favorite role, mediator between the two most important women in his life when their needs and expectations collided. Mom? He said, turning to Dot with the careful tone he'd learned to use when family dynamics became complicated. What's this about? Dot faced her son, this man she'd raised to be thoughtful and considerate but who had somehow learned to avoid difficult conversations rather than address them directly. She loved him deeply, but she was tired of protecting him from the uncomfortable realities of the household he nominally managed. I've booked a 6-month Mediterranean cruise, she said simply. I leave November 15th. I wanted to give you both enough notice to make alternative arrangements for childcare and household management. The words settled over the kitchen like a bomb, detonating in slow motion. Marcus's face went through several expressions as he processed the implications. Not just the logistical challenges, but the fundamental statement his mother was making about her priorities and her role in their family. A cruise, he repeated slowly. For 6 months. By yourself. By myself, Dot confirmed. I've been looking forward to traveling ever since your father died, but I kept putting it off because I felt needed here. Recently, I've realized that feeling needed and being genuinely valued are different things. The distinction hit Marcus with visible force. He was intelligent enough to recognize the criticism embedded in her statement, honest enough to acknowledge that her observation might be accurate. For 4 years, they had organized their lives around her availability, without explicitly acknowledging the sacrifice this represented, or ensuring that her contributions were truly appreciated rather than simply expected. "We do value you, Mom," Marcus said quietly. "More than you know. This family wouldn't function without you." "Function," Dot repeated the word thoughtfully. "That's exactly the problem, Marcus. I've become a functional component of your household, rather than a person whose own needs and desires matter. When Stephanie volunteers me for childcare without asking, when you assume I'm available for evening babysitting because I don't have anything else to do, when the children repeat that I help families because I need something to feel useful, that's not being valued. That's being taken for granted." Stephanie's face had grown progressively paler as Dot articulated the pattern of behavior that she had never seen clearly before. The casual assumptions, the automatic volunteering of Dot's time, the reduction of her grandmother role to a convenient solution for childcare challenges. It all sounded different when spoken aloud than it had felt when she was simply managing logistics. "I never meant to make you feel unappreciated," Stephanie said, her voice smaller than usual. "I thought you enjoyed helping with the children. I thought being involved in our daily lives made you happy." "I do enjoy my grandchildren," Dot replied. "I love them deeply. But loving them doesn't mean I have no other interests or obligations. It doesn't mean my time is infinitely flexible, or that my schedule exists solely to accommodate yours." The kitchen fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of neighborhood traffic. 3 adults sat with the weight of truths that had been avoided for years, recognizing that comfortable assumptions about family obligations and mutual support were more complicated than anyone had wanted to acknowledge. "What can we do?" Marcus asked finally. "How can we fix this?" The question revealed both his genuine desire to repair their relationship and his continued focus on finding solutions that would restore the previous arrangement, rather than accepting that fundamental changes might be necessary. He wanted to fix the problem of Dot's dissatisfaction without necessarily addressing the underlying issues that had created it. "You can start by understanding that this isn't a problem to be fixed," Dot said gently. "This is a decision I've made about how I want to spend the next 6 months of my life. I'm not punishing anyone or trying to make a point. I'm simply choosing to prioritize my own desires for once." She stood up from the kitchen table, moving toward the window that looked out over the backyard, where the twins' playground equipment sat unused in the morning sun. The space represented so much of what her life had become, arrangements made for other people's benefit, maintained by her labor, enjoyed by everyone except the person who had made it possible. "I've spent 4 years helping this family establish itself," she continued, her back still turned to Marcus and Stephanie. "I've provided childcare, household management, emotional support, and financial assistance whenever needed. I've loved doing it, but I've also lost myself in the process. The cruise isn't about running away from you. It's about remembering who I am beyond my roles as grandmother and household manager." When she turned back to face them, both Marcus and Stephanie were staring at her with expressions that suggested they were seeing her clearly for the first time in years. Not as the infinitely available grandmother, who existed primarily to facilitate their lives, but as a complete person with her own dreams and needs that had been systematically sublimated to everyone else's convenience. 6 weeks, Dot said firmly. That's how much time you have to figure out alternative arrangements. I suggest you start by making a list of everything I currently do for this household. All the childcare, cooking, cleaning, scheduling, and emotional labor that you've been taking for granted. Then you can decide how to redistribute those responsibilities in a way that doesn't assume my free labor is your birthright. The challenge was clear and unavoidable. For 6 weeks, Marcus and Stephanie would need to confront the reality of how completely their lifestyle depended on Dot's unpaid contributions. More importantly, they would need to decide whether they could learn to appreciate her as a person rather than simply depend on her as a resource. As Dot walked upstairs to begin the research that would occupy her morning passport renewal, travel insurance, wardrobe planning for 6 months at sea, she felt lighter than she had in years. The conversation had been difficult, but it had also been liberating. She had spoken her truth clearly and without apology, established boundaries that prioritized her own well-being, and given her family the opportunity to choose how they wanted to respond. The Mediterranean was calling, and in 6 weeks, she would answer. But first, she would have the satisfaction of watching Marcus and Stephanie discover exactly how useless she really was. The 48 hours following Dot's announcement created a fascinating study in family dynamics under pressure. What had once been a smoothly functioning household suddenly revealed its dependence on invisible labor that everyone had taken for granted. It was like watching a well-oiled machine discover that its most essential component had been operating without recognition or maintenance for years. Thursday morning brought the first real test of the new reality. Stephanie had a 7 a.m. training session with her highest-paying client, a tech executive who paid premium rates for early morning workouts before her demanding schedule kicked in. Normally, this would have been handled seamlessly. Stephanie would leave before the twins woke up, confident that Dot would manage breakfast, getting them dressed, and drop off at preschool. But Wednesday night's dinner conversation had established new parameters. Dot had been polite but firm. She would continue her normal routines until November 15th, but she would no longer accept last-minute schedule changes or assumptions about her availability. If Stephanie needed childcare for her early client, she would need to arrange it explicitly and in advance. The result was enlightening. At 6:45 a.m., Dot sat in her kitchen drinking coffee and reading the news, while upstairs she could hear increasingly frantic activity. Marcus's voice carried a note of barely controlled panic as he tried to manage twin 4-year-olds who were confused about why Daddy was helping them get dressed instead of Grandma Dot. Stephanie's voice was sharp with stress as she called her client to explain she might be a few minutes late due to unexpected childcare complications. By 7:15, both parents had appeared in the kitchen with two partially dressed, mildly traumatized children who couldn't understand why their usual morning routine had been disrupted. Lily's hair was half-brushed, Mason's shirt was on backwards, and both twins looked like they'd been dressed by people who weren't familiar with the complex engineering of 4-year-old clothing. "Could you possibly?" Stephanie began, then stopped herself as she remembered the new boundaries that had been established. Instead, she knelt down to fix Mason's shirt, while Marcus attempted to tackle Lily's hair with the clumsy determination of someone who had never mastered ponytail construction. Dot watched this domestic chaos with the detached interest of an anthropologist observing unfamiliar social behaviors. She felt no urge to intervene, no automatic impulse to solve problems that weren't hers to manage. It was remarkably liberating to sit quietly, while other adults figured out basic parenting logistics. "We're going to be so late," Stephanie muttered, abandoning the hair project to grab her training bag. "Marcus, can you handle drop-off? I absolutely cannot reschedule this client again." "I've got parent conferences starting at 8, Marcus replied, his own stress levels clearly escalating. "Maybe we could call the preschool and explain." "Or," Dot said mildly, not looking up from her newspaper, "you could leave right now and figure out the hair situation in the car. Preschool teachers have seen worse things than imperfect ponytails." Both parents stared at her with expressions suggesting they'd forgotten she was present. The woman who had silently solved these problems for 4 years was now offering practical advice instead of automatic solutions. It was a subtle but significant shift that highlighted how completely they had relied on her invisible labor. Friday brought the preschool play that Lily had been excited about for weeks. At 1:45 p.m., Dot sat in the small auditorium alongside other grandparents and parents who had rearranged their schedules to watch 15 minutes of 4-year-olds singing songs about autumn leaves and friendship. The performance was charming in the way that only genuinely amateur productions could be, full of forgotten lines, enthusiastic off-key singing, and the kind of concentrated cuteness that made every adult in the room pull out their phones despite the no-recording policy. Stephanie arrived just as the lights dimmed, having apparently sprinted from her car in the parking lot. She slid into the seat beside Dot, with the breathless relief of someone who had almost missed something important. During intermission between songs, she leaned over to whisper, "Thank you for reminding me about this. I almost scheduled a client consultation this afternoon." The comment revealed how much Stephanie's calendar management had depended on Dot's memory for family events and obligations. Without her grandmother's automatic tracking of school activities, social commitments, and appointment schedules, details were beginning to slip through cracks that no one had realized existed. After the performance, as families gathered in the hallway to congratulate their young performers, Dot found herself in conversation with Patricia Williams, another grandmother whose own relationship with childcare responsibilities had evolved over the years. My daughter-in-law went through a phase where she expected me to be available whenever convenient, Patricia confided, watching Stephanie navigate social conversations with other parents while keeping one eye on the twins. Took me moving to Florida for 6 months to reset those expectations. Best thing I ever did for our relationship. The conversation was illuminating. Patricia's experience suggested that Dot's situation wasn't unique. Many grandmothers struggled with the boundary between helpful family support and unpaid domestic labor. The difference was that Patricia had addressed the problem years earlier, before resentment had time to build into something more destructive. How did your family react when you established new boundaries? Dot asked, genuinely curious about successful navigation of these complex dynamics. Badly at first, Patricia admitted with a laugh. Lots of guilt trips about abandoning the grandchildren and not supporting the family. But 6 months of managing their own childcare taught them to appreciate my help instead of expecting it. Now when I babysit, it's because I want to, not because I'm the default solution to their scheduling problems. The perspective was encouraging. Patricia's story suggested that temporary disruption could lead to healthier long-term relationships, that establishing boundaries wasn't selfish but necessary for maintaining mutual respect within families. Saturday morning brought another revelation about the hidden complexity of Dot's contributions to household management. Stephanie stood in the kitchen at 9 a.m., staring at the refrigerator with the confused expression of someone confronting an unfamiliar problem. Do we normally go grocery shopping on Saturdays? She asked Dot, who was sitting at the table planning cruise excursions on her laptop. I normally go grocery shopping on Saturdays, Dot replied without looking up from her research about Greek island tours. You normally make plans that assume the groceries will somehow appear. The distinction was subtle but important. For 4 years, Stephanie had organized her weekends around social activities, client consultations, and personal time, while assuming that household necessities would be handled by someone else. She had never learned when groceries were purchased, what the weekly budget looked like, or how meal planning worked in a household that included 2 adults and 2 children with specific preferences and dietary needs. Could you possibly write down the usual list? Stephanie asked, her tone carrying the careful politeness of someone who was beginning to understand that her requests were no longer automatic acceptances. I could, Dot agreed, but it might be more useful for you to figure out what your family actually eats and how much you want to spend feeding them. Those are decisions that the people doing the shopping and cooking should probably make. By noon, Marcus and Stephanie were standing in their kitchen surrounded by takeout menus, trying to figure out how much money they typically spent on food and whether they knew enough about their children's preferences to shop intelligently. The conversation revealed that neither parent had been paying attention to the daily logistics that kept their household functioning. Did you know that Mason won't eat sandwiches if the bread is too thick? Stephanie asked Marcus, reading from a list she was attempting to compile. And Lily only likes strawberry yogurt, not the mixed berry kind? Mom handles all that stuff, Marcus replied automatically, then stopped as he realized what he'd said. His mother did handle all that stuff. The careful attention to individual preferences, the budget management, the meal planning that made family dinners possible instead of nightly negotiations about acceptable food options. Sunday evening brought the weekly family meeting that Dot had instituted without consultation or negotiation. She simply announced that they would be gathering at 7 p.m. to discuss household responsibilities and scheduling for the upcoming week. The format was non-negotiable. The content was open for discussion. I've been thinking about what you said, Marcus began, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who had spent considerable time processing uncomfortable truths. About the difference between being needed and being valued. I think we've been taking your contributions for granted, without realizing how much our lifestyle depends on your unpaid labor. The acknowledgement was progress, but Dot had learned to be cautious about promises made during crisis periods. What are you planning to do about that recognition? She asked. We want to hire a housekeeper, Stephanie said quickly, and look into after-school care programs for the twins. We've been research childcare options that don't require you to sacrifice your own time and interests. That sounds like a good start, Dot agreed. But I'm curious about the timeline. Are these arrangements for after I leave on the cruise, Or are you planning to implement them now as a way of demonstrating that you can function independently? The question caught both parents off guard. They had been thinking about Dot's cruise as a temporary disruption that required temporary solutions, not as a permanent shift toward greater self-sufficiency that might continue even after her return. "I guess I assumed you'd want to resume your usual routines when you got back," Marcus admitted. "The twins love having you involved in their daily lives." "And I love being involved," Dot replied. "But I want that involvement to be by choice rather than assumption. I want to be invited to participate rather than expected to provide services. There's a significant difference between being a cherished grandmother and being unpaid household staff." As the meeting concluded with tentative plans for increased parental responsibility and explicit appreciation for Dot's contributions, she felt cautiously optimistic about the family's ability to learn from this crisis. But she also remained committed to her cruise plans, understanding that 6 months of independence would be valuable regardless of how successfully her family adjusted to her new boundaries. The Mediterranean was still calling, and in just over 4 weeks, she would answer that call with the confidence of someone who had finally learned to value her own dreams as highly as everyone else's needs. 3 weeks into what Dot had privately begun calling, quote, the adjustment period, the Henderson household had settled into an uneasy rhythm that felt less like family harmony and more like a carefully choreographed dance around a live explosive. Everyone was trying harder, being more considerate, expressing gratitude more explicitly. But underneath the improved surface interactions, tension was building like pressure in a sealed container. The source of that tension wasn't Dot's impending cruise, though that certainly added urgency to every conversation. The real problem was that Marcus and Stephanie were discovering exactly how much work was involved in managing a household and raising children without a live-in support system, and the reality was far more overwhelming than either had anticipated. Tuesday morning brought a perfect example of the new complications. Stephanie had hired a housekeeping service to handle the deep cleaning that Dot had been doing quietly for 4 years. But the cleaners required someone to be present during their 3-hour session. Since Stephanie had client appointments all morning and Marcus was teaching, they found themselves in the position of paying someone to clean their house while also paying someone else to watch their children so that Dot could supervise the cleaning crew. "This is costing us $400 for one morning," Stephanie announced over breakfast, her voice tight with stress that had become increasingly familiar. "The housekeeper is $180, the babysitter is $60, and the cleaning crew is $160. That's nearly $1,600 a month just to replace services that used to be." She trailed off, realizing that completing the sentence would acknowledge exactly how much unpaid labor Dot had been providing. The mathematics of replacement were stark and uncomfortable. Hiring professional services to handle Dot's contributions would cost more than Marcus's monthly teaching salary. "Maybe we don't need professional house cleaning," Marcus suggested, though the prospect of deep cleaning bathrooms and kitchen floors around his teaching schedule clearly held no appeal. "We could probably manage basic maintenance ourselves." Dot watched this conversation from her position at the kitchen table, where she was reviewing Mediterranean cruise shore excursion options on her laptop. The discussion was illuminating, not because it revealed financial constraints — the family could afford these services if they adjusted their budget — but because it highlighted how completely Marcus and Stephanie had been insulated from the true cost of household management. "The cleaning isn't really the problem," Dot observed mildly, not looking up from her research about Greek archaeological sites. "The problem is that you're trying to hire individual services to replace integrated household management. Professional cleaners can't also pack school lunches, coordinate doctor appointments, and remember that Mason has a field trip on Friday." The comment hung in the air like a challenge that neither Marcus nor Stephanie wanted to address directly. They were beginning to understand that Dot's contributions hadn't been just about specific tasks, but about the mental and emotional labor of anticipating needs, remembering details, and coordinating the countless moving pieces that kept family life functioning smoothly. Wednesday brought the incident that would later be remembered as the beginning of the end of diplomatic solutions. Stephanie had arranged for her sister Kelly to visit for the weekend, a plan that had been made weeks earlier, before the cruise announcement had disrupted everyone's assumptions about household arrangements. Kelly lived in San Diego with her hedge fund manager husband and their teenage children, and her visits typically involved elaborate meals, entertainment planning, and the kind of gracious hosting that required significant preparation. I was thinking we could do that lamb roast you make so well, Stephanie said to Dot over breakfast Wednesday morning. Kelly always raves about your cooking, and it would be such a nice way to show her how well our family works together. The request was phrased as a compliment, but it carried the familiar assumption that Dot would handle the labor-intensive meal preparation for a social event she hadn't been consulted about planning. More problematically, it treated her cooking skills as a family resource to be deployed for Stephanie's benefit, rather than a personal talent that she might choose to share or not. "I'm not available to cook elaborate meals for your sister's visit," Dot replied calmly, closing her laptop to give the conversation her full attention. "I have plans this weekend that don't include meal preparation for guests I wasn't consulted about inviting." Stephanie's face went through several expressions as she processed this response. For 4 years, family visits had been seamlessly managed by Dot's invisible labor, the meal planning, grocery shopping, cooking, and cleanup that made entertaining appear effortless. The idea that this service might not be automatically available had clearly never occurred to her. "But Kelly is expecting." Stephanie began, then stopped as she realized that her sister's expectations were based on previous visits, when Dot had provided services that were no longer guaranteed. "I mean, I told her we'd have a nice family dinner." "You can still have a nice family dinner," Dot agreed. "You'll just need to plan, shop, cook, and clean up, without assuming that someone else will handle the actual work while you manage the social aspects." The distinction between hosting and hospitality was subtle but crucial. Stephanie was excellent at the social performance of entertaining. The conversation, the gracious welcome, the creation of atmosphere that made guests feel valued. But the behind-the-scenes labor that made such performances possible had been Dot's domain, and Stephanie had never learned the practical skills required to manage both aspects simultaneously. Thursday evening brought a conversation that revealed the depth of the family's adjustment challenges. Marcus arrived home from school to find Stephanie sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by printed pages from childcare websites, her laptop open to a spreadsheet that appeared to be tracking various service costs and availability. "I've been researching after-school programs," Stephanie announced, her voice carrying the strained optimism of someone trying to solve an overwhelming problem through sheer determination. "The good news is that there are several options. The challenging news is that none of them exactly match our needs." She had discovered what working parents without family support had always known: quality childcare that accommodated irregular schedules, unexpected emergencies, and specific family preferences was expensive, limited, and often unavailable when most needed. The programs she'd researched offered structure and safety, but they couldn't provide the flexibility and personalized attention that Dot had offered automatically. "What kind of challenges?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would be complicated. "Well, most after-school programs end at 6 p.m., but I often have clients who want to train in the evening. The extended care programs cost extra and require advance notice for late pickup. None of them can handle unexpected schedule changes or sick days when the children can't attend regular programming." Stephanie's research had revealed the complex logistics that many families navigated daily, but it had also highlighted how much their current lifestyle depended on having someone whose primary obligation was facilitating everyone else's convenience. Dot's flexibility hadn't been a luxury, it had been the foundation that made their careers and social commitments possible. "Maybe I could adjust my teaching schedule," Marcus suggested, though they both knew that his position at the middle school offered limited flexibility. "Or you could restructure your client appointments to work around the children's schedules." The conversation continued with increasingly creative solutions that all involved significant sacrifices to careers and income that had been built around the assumption of free, flexible childcare. Neither parent wanted to acknowledge the obvious conclusion: their current lifestyle was only sustainable with Dot's unpaid contributions. Friday brought the crisis that would change everything. Lily woke up with a fever, and the kind of congested cough that meant she couldn't attend preschool. In the old system, this would have been handled automatically. Stephanie would have called Dot, who would have adjusted her own plans to provide sick childcare while parents maintained their work commitments. But the new boundaries meant that Stephanie needed to negotiate rather than assume. She appeared in Dot's bedroom at 6:30 a.m., still in her pajamas, looking genuinely distressed. "Lily's sick," she announced. "I have 3 client sessions scheduled today, including one new consultation that I really can't reschedule. Marcus has a faculty meeting this afternoon that he's been preparing for all week. Could you possibly—" "No," Dot said simply, not unkindly, but without compromise. "I have plans today that I'm not willing to change. You'll need to figure out alternative arrangements." The refusal was gentle but absolute, and it forced Stephanie to confront the reality that emergency childcare was now her responsibility to solve rather than Dot's obligation to provide. This was exactly the kind of situation that revealed how completely the family's logistics depended on Dot's infinite flexibility. What followed was 3 hours of increasingly desperate phone calls, as Stephanie tried to find someone willing to watch a sick 4-year-old on short notice. Family friends were at work, professional babysitters wouldn't accept sick children, and emergency childcare services had waiting lists or requirements that couldn't be met immediately. By 10 a.m., Stephanie had canceled 2 client sessions and was facing the reality that her new consultation, a potential high-value client who had specifically requested an afternoon appointment, would also need to be rescheduled. The financial cost was significant, but the professional embarrassment was worse. She was forced to explain to someone she'd been trying to impress that her childcare arrangements had fallen through. "This is unsustainable," Stephanie said to Marcus when he found her sitting in the kitchen at noon, having finally arranged for a neighbor to watch Lily for 2 hours so she could salvage her most important client meeting. "We can't run our careers around the hope that the children never get sick or have unexpected needs." "What are you suggesting?" Marcus asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew where this conversation was heading. "I'm suggesting that maybe we've been taking your mother's support for granted in ways that we didn't fully understand," Stephanie replied carefully. "And maybe we need to figure out how to appreciate what she provides instead of treating it like something we're entitled to." The admission was significant. The first time Stephanie had explicitly acknowledged that the problem wasn't finding adequate replacements for Dot's services, but recognizing the value of what she had been providing voluntarily. It was a crucial distinction that shifted the conversation from logistics to relationships, from problem-solving to gratitude. But even as this recognition was emerging, a larger crisis was building toward the confrontation that would change everything. Kelly's visit was scheduled for Saturday, and Stephanie had been too proud to admit to her successful sister that the family's domestic arrangements were in transition. Instead, she had been making increasingly elaborate promises about weekend activities and family meals that she had no realistic plan for executing. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of perfect October weather that made Phoenix feel like paradise. Clear skies, gentle breeze, temperatures that invited outdoor activities and alfresco dining. It was the kind of day that should have showcased the Henderson family at their best, demonstrating the harmony and success that Stephanie wanted to project to her sister. Instead, it became the day when all the accumulated stress, unmet expectations, and unresolved tensions would explode into the public confrontation that made Dot's cruise feel less like a vacation and more like an escape from a family that had forgotten how to treat her with basic respect. The morning began badly when Kelly arrived to find Marcus in the kitchen trying to figure out how to prepare the elaborate brunch that Stephanie had promised. The house showed signs of hurried cleaning. Surfaces wiped but corners ignored, dishes clean but not properly organized. It was the kind of maintenance that looked adequate until compared to the deeper cleanliness that Dot had maintained effortlessly. "Where's Dorothy?" Kelly asked, looking around for the grandmother whose presence had made previous visits so seamless. "I was hoping to catch up with her before the day gets too busy." The question highlighted something that Stephanie had been trying to avoid acknowledging. Kelly's visits weren't just about sister time, but about enjoying the gracious hospitality that Dot's invisible labor had made possible. The elaborate meals, the well-maintained house, the smooth coordination of activities, all of it had created an impression of family success that was now revealed to be unsustainable without Dot's unpaid contributions. "She's around here somewhere," Stephanie said vaguely, though she knew perfectly well that Dot was in her room doing research for her cruise, and had made it clear that she wouldn't be participating in weekend hosting duties she hadn't agreed to take on. The day was about to become very interesting indeed. Diani disatre vamesipi parhuen, vamesibibi bachlemanis jacamasaklid. Saturday afternoon unfolded with the kind of mounting chaos that makes family gatherings memorable for all the wrong reasons. By 2 p.m., it was clear that Stephanie's ambitious plans for showcasing family harmony to her sister Kelly were colliding spectacularly with the reality of managing a household without Dot's invisible support system. The elaborate lunch that Stephanie had promised had devolved into a complicated scramble involving takeout containers from 3 different restaurants, paper plates because the good dishes were dirty and no one had thought to run the dishwasher, and a dining room table that bore the evidence of hurried cleaning, crumbs swept into corners, children's art projects hastily stacked rather than properly organized. Kelly, pristine in her designer athleisure and emanating the kind of effortless perfection that came from having a full-time housekeeper and nanny, surveyed the domestic disorder with the carefully neutral expression of someone trying not to appear judgmental while clearly being judgmental. "This is cozy," Kelly said, settling gingerly onto the sectional sofa that showed evidence of recent twin occupancy, mysterious stains, scattered goldfish crackers, and the kind of general chaos that accumulated when parents were too overwhelmed to maintain their usual standards. Stephanie's jaw tightened at the diplomatic assessment. She had spent 4 years using Kelly's visits to demonstrate how well her family was thriving, how successfully she had balanced motherhood with her fitness business, how graciously she managed the kind of multi-generational household that looked ideal on social media. The contrast between those previous visits and the current reality was stark enough to make her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "We're in a bit of a transition period," Stephanie explained, her voice carrying the strained cheerfulness of someone working very hard to maintain appearances. "Dorothy has become quite independent lately. She's planning some extended travel, so we're adjusting our routines to be more self-sufficient." The explanation was technically accurate but carefully constructed to avoid admitting that the family's domestic success had been entirely dependent on unpaid labor from a woman they had gradually learned to take for granted. Kelly, who possessed the social intelligence that came from navigating competitive social circles in San Diego, immediately sensed the undercurrents of tension. "How exciting for Dorothy," Kelly replied with genuine warmth. "She's always struck me as someone with interesting stories to tell. Where is she planning to travel?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that Stephanie couldn't quite figure out how to answer. Admitting that Dot was taking a 6-month cruise would invite follow-up questions about finances, planning, and the family dynamics that had led to such a dramatic decision. But deflecting would make the situation seem more mysterious and problematic than it already appeared. "She's booked a Mediterranean cruise," Marcus answered when Stephanie's pause stretched too long. 6 months. Leaving in about 3 weeks. Kelly's eyebrows rose with the kind of impressed surprise that wealthy people reserved for expensive decisions that demonstrated real independence. A 6-month Mediterranean cruise represented the kind of luxury that even Kelly's husband's hedge fund salary made noteworthy. "That sounds absolutely wonderful," Kelly said, her enthusiasm genuine. "What an adventure! She must be so excited. Is she traveling with a group or is this a solo journey?" "Solo," Dot's voice came from the kitchen doorway, where she had appeared with the quiet suddenness of someone who had been listening to the conversation from the adjacent room. She wore a simple navy dress and carried herself with the dignified bearing of someone who had decided to stop hiding from family complications. "Dorothy!" Kelly rose to embrace her with the kind of genuine affection that made Stephanie realize how much her sister had always enjoyed Dot's company during previous visits. "A solo Mediterranean cruise. How incredibly brave and exciting. Tell me everything." Dot settled into the chair that had once been Robert's favorite, accepting Kelly's attention with the pleased expression of someone whose plans were being treated as adventures, rather than abandonment of family responsibilities. "I'm starting in Barcelona and ending in Istanbul," Dot explained, her voice carrying enthusiasm that had been notably absent during recent family conversations. "Small ship, educational programming, plenty of time to explore ancient sites and museums. It's everything Robert and I always talked about doing someday." "That sounds absolutely perfect," Kelly said, then turned to Stephanie with curiosity that felt dangerously perceptive. It must be exciting to have such an adventurous mother-in-law. How are you managing the household transition? The question was phrased politely, but Kelly's intelligence and social experience allowed her to read the tension that was radiating from Stephanie like heat from pavement. This wasn't just a grandmother taking a well-deserved vacation. This was a family dynamic in crisis, with undercurrents that suggested significant conflict beneath the surface politeness. "We're figuring it out," Stephanie replied carefully, shooting Marcus a look that clearly communicated her desire for support in maintaining the fiction that everything was under control. "Actually," Marcus said, apparently missing or ignoring his wife's signal, "it's been really eye-opening to discover how much Mom contributes to our daily operations. We had no idea how much invisible work she was doing to keep everything running smoothly." The admission was honest but poorly timed, revealing exactly the kind of family dynamics that Stephanie had been hoping to keep private. Kelly's expression shifted from polite curiosity to genuine interest, as she recognized that she was witnessing something more significant than routine travel planning. "Invisible work?" Kelly asked, her tone encouraging further explanation. "Childcare, meal planning, household management, schedule coordination," Dot listed with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reciting job responsibilities. "The kind of tasks that families often assume will be handled by grandmothers who live with them, regardless of whether those arrangements were explicitly negotiated or just evolved over time." The words carried an edge that made Stephanie's stomach tighten, with anticipation of where this conversation might be heading. Dot's tone wasn't angry, exactly, but it held the kind of controlled precision that suggested years of accumulated frustration finally finding expression. "It sounds like you've been running a multi-generational household," Kelly observed, her social worker background giving her insight into family dynamics that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. "That's challenging under the best circumstances, and it requires really clear communication about expectations and boundaries." "Clear communication," Stephanie repeated with a laugh that held no humor. "Yes, that's definitely been an area for improvement in our family." The twins chose that moment to burst into the living room with the kind of chaotic energy that 4-year-olds brought to family gatherings. They had been playing in the backyard under Marcus's sporadic supervision, and their appearance suggested that supervision had been interpreted quite loosely. Lily's dress was stained with what appeared to be mud and grass, Mason's face bore evidence of some kind of snack food consumption, and both children radiated the wild energy of kids who had been left to entertain themselves for too long. "Aunt Kelly!" they chorused, launching themselves at their visitor with the enthusiasm that made adults simultaneously charmed and overwhelmed. Kelly embraced them with genuine affection, but Dot could see her taking in the details that revealed how differently this visit was being managed compared to previous occasions. Usually, the twins appeared for brief supervised interactions with visiting relatives, clean, well-fed, and guided through appropriate social behaviors by adults who had time to focus on their presentation. Today, they bore the evidence of minimal supervision and maximum freedom, which would have been fine if it had been an intentional choice rather than the result of overwhelmed parents who were discovering how much work was involved in simultaneous hosting and childcare. "We've been playing pirates," Mason announced, brandishing a stick that had clearly been repurposed as a sword. "Daddy said we could make a fort out of the patio furniture." Kelly glanced toward the sliding glass doors that revealed the backyard, where the expensive outdoor dining set had indeed been transformed into an elaborate fortress of cushions, umbrellas, and architectural creativity that would require significant effort to restore to its original configuration. "That looks like an impressive construction project," Kelly said diplomatically, though her expression suggested she was calculating how long it would take to clean up the elaborate mess. "Grandma Dot usually helps us build better forts," Lily added, with the unconscious honesty that made 4-year-olds both delightful and dangerous during family gatherings. "But she said she's too busy getting ready for her big trip to help with projects anymore." The statement landed in the living room like a small explosion, revealing family tensions that all the adults had been trying to navigate around. Stephanie's face flushed with embarrassment at having her domestic challenges exposed through her daughter's innocent observation. "I'm sure Grandma Dot has lots of important planning to do," Kelly said smoothly, but her eyes were sharp with interest as she absorbed the implications of what Lily had revealed. She's been on her computer a lot, Mason added helpfully. Mommy said Grandma Dot is being selfish because she's not helping the family anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the furniture. Stephanie's face had gone pale with mortification, and Dot sat very still with the expression of someone who had just heard something that confirmed her worst suspicions about how her family really viewed her decision to prioritize her own needs. Mason, Stephanie said quickly, her voice tight with panic. That's not exactly what Mommy said. Yes, it is, Lily interrupted with the brutal honesty of childhood. You said Grandma Dot used to be helpful, but now she's being useless, because she won't watch us when you want to work. The word useless hung in the air like a toxic cloud, transforming the awkward family gathering into something much more serious. Kelly's expression shifted from diplomatic interest to genuine shock as she processed what the children had innocently revealed about the family dynamics that had been hidden beneath polite conversation. Dot stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled in a way that suggested she was working very hard to maintain her composure. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of quiet intensity that made everyone in the room understand that something irreversible was about to happen. Useless, she repeated, looking directly at Stephanie. That's an interesting word choice, particularly coming from someone whose entire lifestyle depends on services I provide for free. Dorothy, I never, Stephanie began, but Dot raised her hand in a gesture that commanded silence. Please don't compound the insult by lying about it, Dot said, her voice remaining calm but carrying an authority that no one in the room wanted to challenge. Your children don't misunderstand adult conversations. They repeat what they hear accurately, even when the adults wish they had been more careful with their words. Kelly looked between the two women with the fascinated horror of someone witnessing a family implosion that had clearly been building for much longer than anyone wanted to acknowledge. This wasn't a simple disagreement about travel plans. This was years of accumulated resentment finally finding expression. Mom, please, Marcus said desperately, recognizing that they had crossed into territory where diplomatic solutions might no longer be possible. I'm sure Stephanie didn't mean what? Dot asked, turning to face her son with eyes that held decades of disappointment. Didn't mean to take my contributions for granted? Didn't mean to characterize my decision to prioritize my own needs as selfishness? Didn't mean to teach my grandchildren that their grandmother is only valuable when she's useful to their parents? The accusations were delivered with surgical precision, each one targeting a specific failure of respect and appreciation that had contributed to the current crisis. Marcus had no response because every charge was accurate, and they all knew it. I think, Dot continued, moving toward the stairs with the dignified bearing of someone who had finally decided to stop enabling behavior she could no longer tolerate, that this conversation has been very illuminating. Kelly, it was lovely to see you again. I hope you enjoy the rest of your visit. Dorothy, wait, Kelly called out, her voice carrying genuine concern. I didn't mean to cause problems by asking about your travel plans. Dot paused at the bottom of the stairs, turning back to face the living room where her family sat, surrounded by the evidence of their domestic dysfunction and their failure to appreciate what they had been taking for granted. You didn't cause anything, she said gently. You simply witnessed the natural consequences of family dynamics that have been unsustainable for a very long time. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to reveal how far a situation has deteriorated. As Dot climbed the stairs to her bedroom, the living room fell into the kind of silence that follows emotional explosions, heavy with shock, regret, and the recognition that some words couldn't be taken back. Stephanie sat frozen in the aftermath of having her private frustrations exposed as public humiliation, while Marcus wrestled with the awareness that his attempts to avoid conflict had allowed a crisis to develop that might now be beyond repair. Kelly looked around the room, taking in the evidence of a family that had lost its way. The overwhelmed parents, the chaos of inadequate household management, the children who had learned to repeat adult complaints without understanding their impact. She had come for a pleasant family visit and instead witnessed the kind of dysfunction that would require serious intervention to resolve. Well, Kelly said finally, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who understood that anything she said would be remembered and analyzed long after she returned to San Diego. It sounds like everyone has some serious thinking to do about what kind of family relationships you want to build going forward. But upstairs in her bedroom, Dot was no longer thinking about relationship repair or family dynamics. She was sitting at her laptop, researching cruise departure logistics, and feeling more certain than ever that 6 months in the Mediterranean was exactly what she needed. The word useless had been the final insult in a long series of disrespectful assumptions, but it had also been liberating. It had given her permission to stop trying to earn appreciation from people who had forgotten how to give it, and to start prioritizing her own happiness over everyone else's convenience. In 3 weeks, she would be boarding a ship in Barcelona, and her family would discover exactly how useless she really was. The 2 weeks following Kelly's visit passed in a strange twilight zone where everyone in the Henderson household moved around each other with the careful politeness of strangers sharing an elevator. Conversations were brief and functional, focused on necessary logistics rather than emotional processing. It was as if the family had collectively decided that pretending the explosion hadn't happened was easier than dealing with its aftermath. Dot found this period oddly liberating. With the word useless finally spoken aloud, she no longer felt obligated to prove her value through constant availability. Instead, she threw herself into cruise preparation with the enthusiasm of someone who had been given permission to prioritize her own excitement for the first time in years. Her bedroom became command central for the most ambitious travel planning she had ever undertaken. The bed was covered with guidebooks about Mediterranean history and culture, language primers for basic phrases in Greek and Turkish, and detailed itineraries for shore excursions that would take her to archaeological sites she had dreamed of visiting since college. The woman who had spent 4 years managing everyone else's schedules was now meticulously planning 6 months of purely personal adventures. Monday morning brought a phone call that crystallized the shift in family dynamics. Janet from the animal shelter called to discuss Dot's increased availability for the upcoming holiday volunteer drive. "We're expecting a lot of surrendered pets after Christmas," Janet explained, "and I was hoping you could take on some additional shifts in January. You've always been our most reliable volunteer for the difficult cases, the older animals that need extra patience and socialization." For a moment, Dot felt the familiar pull of obligation, the automatic yes that had characterized her response to requests for help throughout her adult life. Then she remembered the cruise itinerary spread across her bedroom, the January excursions to ancient ruins in Turkey that she had specifically chosen for their winter departure dates. "I'm actually going to be unavailable for the next 6 months," Dot said, surprising herself with how natural the words felt. "I'm taking an extended cruise starting next week." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Dot to imagine Janet processing this completely unexpected information. In 15 years of volunteering, Dot had never taken more than a week's vacation, and she had certainly never announced extended unavailability with such casual confidence. 6 months? Janet repeated, her voice carrying the same shocked surprise that had characterized everyone's reaction to Dot's travel plans. "That's wonderful. How exciting. We'll miss you terribly, but what an amazing opportunity." The genuine enthusiasm in Janet's voice stood in stark contrast to her family's response to the same announcement. Here was someone who understood that a 62-year-old woman taking a solo cruise was an achievement to be celebrated rather than an abandonment to be criticized. Tuesday brought the delivery of cruise wardrobe items that Dot had been accumulating through online shopping, lightweight layers for Mediterranean weather, comfortable walking shoes for archaeological sites, and a few elegant pieces for the ship's formal dining nights. The packages felt like presents to herself, each one representing choices made purely for her own pleasure rather than family functionality. She was organizing these new clothes in her suitcase when Stephanie appeared in the bedroom doorway, holding a cup of coffee and wearing the kind of carefully neutral expression that suggested she had been rehearsing this conversation. "That's a lot of beautiful clothes," Stephanie observed, her tone carrying forced lightness that didn't quite mask the underlying tension. "You're really committing to this trip." "I am," Dot agreed, not looking up from the delicate task of folding silk scarves that would protect her neck from Mediterranean sun and wind. "It's amazing how much planning goes into 6 months of travel when you're determined to make the most of every opportunity." Stephanie entered the room uninvited, settling on the edge of the bed with the presumptuous familiarity that had characterized her relationship with Dot's personal space for 4 years. "I've been thinking about what the kids said during Kelly's visit," she began carefully, "about the useless comment. I want you to know that's not how I really feel about you." Dot finally looked up from her packing, studying Stephanie's face with the detached interest of someone who no longer felt obligated to make uncomfortable conversations easier for other people. "How do you really feel about me, Stephanie?" The direct question clearly caught Stephanie off guard. She had obviously prepared for defensive explanations or diplomatic deflections, not honest self-examination about her actual feelings toward her mother-in-law. "I think you're incredibly capable," Stephanie said slowly, choosing her words with the care of someone navigating a minefield. "And generous. And I think I've gotten so accustomed to your help that I forgot to appreciate it properly." "That's a very diplomatic answer," Dot observed, returning to her packing. "But it doesn't address the fundamental issue, which is that you've come to view my contributions as services you're entitled to rather than gifts I choose to give." The distinction was subtle but crucial, and Stephanie's uncomfortable silence suggested she understood its significance. For 4 years, she had operated under the assumption that Dot's availability was a family resource to be managed and deployed as needed. The idea that this availability was voluntary, and therefore revocable, had apparently never occurred to her. "What would it take for you to feel properly appreciated?" Stephanie asked finally, her voice carrying the tentative hope of someone looking for negotiable terms that might restore previous arrangements. Dot paused in her folding, considering the question that revealed Stephanie's continued focus on finding solutions that would return their relationship to its previous functional state. "I think," she said carefully, "that appreciation isn't something you can demonstrate in response to a crisis. It's something you build through consistent behavior over time." The answer clearly wasn't what Stephanie had hoped to hear. She had been looking for specific actions that might repair their relationship quickly enough to affect Dot's travel plans. Instead, she was being told that trust and respect required long-term consistency that couldn't be manufactured during a 2-week reconciliation period. Wednesday brought Marcus's attempt at family diplomacy, timed for the evening when the twins were in bed, and he could speak frankly without worrying about little ears absorbing adult complications. "Mom, I know things have been tense since Kelly's visit," he began, settling into the kitchen chair across from where Dot was reviewing her cruise departure checklist. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said about feeling taken for granted, and I want you to know that Stephanie and I are committed to making changes when you get back from your trip." The conditional nature of his promise, "changes when you get back," revealed his continued assumption that the cruise was a temporary disruption rather than a permanent shift in family dynamics. He was still thinking in terms of managing the crisis until normal operations could resume, rather than acknowledging that normal operations had been fundamentally unhealthy. "What kind of changes?" Dot asked, though her tone suggested she was testing his understanding rather than seeking reassurance. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened what appeared to be a carefully prepared list. "We're going to hire a regular housekeeper, enroll the kids in an after-school program, and establish clear boundaries around your time and availability. We want to make sure you know your help is a gift we're grateful for, not a service we expect." The presentation was well-intentioned but felt rehearsed, as if Marcus had been practicing talking points rather than processing genuine insights about family respect. More problematically, it still framed the conversation around what they would do for Dot, rather than what they had learned about treating her as an autonomous adult. "Those sound like positive changes," Dot agreed neutrally, "but I'm curious about the timeline. Are these adjustments you're planning to implement now as a demonstration of change priorities? Or are they contingent on my return from the cruise?" The question exposed the weakness in Marcus's approach. He was offering future changes as incentives for Dot to maintain her previous level of availability, rather than implementing them immediately as evidence of genuine transformation. "Well," Marcus said carefully, "some of them we could start right away, but others might be easier to organize once we know what our permanent schedule looks like after you're back." There it was, the assumption that her travel was temporary and that their family arrangements would eventually return to something resembling their previous structure. Marcus was negotiating for a return to the status quo with minor modifications, not accepting that the status quo had been fundamentally problematic. "Marcus," Dot said gently, "I think you're still thinking about this as a problem to be solved rather than a relationship to be rebuilt. The changes you're describing sound like management techniques rather than expressions of respect." The observation hit its target. Marcus's face showed the uncomfortable recognition that his careful planning had missed the emotional core of their family crisis. He had been trying to engineer solutions that would restore functionality rather than address the underlying disrespect that had made functionality possible. Thursday brought the arrival of Dot's new passport, expedited processing that had cost extra but ensured she would have proper documentation for international travel. Holding the crisp blue booklet felt like holding possibility itself, the freedom to cross borders, explore new places, and make decisions based purely on her own curiosity and interests. That evening, she made her final cruise payment and received confirmation of shore excursion bookings that would take her to Pompeii, the Acropolis, and archaeological sites in Turkey that she had been reading about for months. Each confirmation email felt like a small victory, evidence that she was creating a future based on her own desires rather than everyone else's needs. Friday morning, exactly 1 week before her departure, Dot made a decision that surprised even her. She called a family meeting, not to negotiate or explain, but to establish final terms for her absence that would protect both her cruise experience and her family's adjustment process. "I wanted to clarify a few things before I leave," she announced to Marcus and Stephanie over breakfast, while the twins ate their cereal with the focused attention that 4-year-olds brought to preferred foods. "I won't be available for phone consultations about household management, emergency babysitting requests, or family crisis mediation while I'm traveling." The announcement created the kind of silence that suggested both parents were processing implications they hadn't previously considered. They had apparently assumed that Dot's physical absence wouldn't necessarily mean emotional unavailability, that she might still serve as remote support for the family challenges they were anticipating. "What if there's a real emergency?" Stephanie asked, her voice carrying genuine concern about managing unknown situations without Dot's safety net. "Then you'll handle it the way millions of families handle emergencies every day," Dot replied calmly, "by making decisions, seeking appropriate help, and learning from the experience. That's how people develop confidence in their own capabilities." The boundary was clear and non-negotiable, establishing that Dot's cruise would be a complete break from family responsibilities, rather than remote management of household operations. It was the final step in her transition from indispensable family resource to independent woman pursuing her own adventures. In exactly 7 days, she would board a ship in Barcelona and begin the journey of rediscovering who she was beyond her roles as grandmother, housekeeper, and family problem solver. The Mediterranean was calling, and she was finally ready to answer. The morning of November 15th arrived with the kind of crisp Phoenix dawn that made Dot grateful she would be spending the next 6 months exploring coastlines, where Mediterranean breezes replaced desert heat. She had been awake since 4 a.m., not from anxiety, but from the pure excitement of someone about to embark on the adventure she had been planning, with increasing enthusiasm for 2 months. Her suitcases sat by the front door like loyal soldiers ready for deployment, each one carefully packed with clothes chosen for comfort, versatility, and the kind of understated elegance that would serve her well in European ports. The cruise documents were organized in her leather portfolio, the same one Robert had used for their tax paperwork, now repurposed for the journey he had always promised they would take someday. The house around her was already showing signs of the adjustment challenges that Marcus and Stephanie would be navigating for the next 6 months. Breakfast dishes from the previous evening sat unwashed in the sink, evidence of a family learning to manage domestic logistics without their invisible support system. The twins' backpacks lay scattered by the door, partially packed with the kind of haphazard organization that suggested parental overwhelm rather than routine efficiency. At 6 a.m., Marcus appeared in the kitchen wearing the rumpled clothes of someone who had been up late trying to organize household systems he had never fully understood. His attempt to maintain normal morning routines without Dot's coordination was already showing strain, and she hadn't even left yet. "Coffee's ready," he announced with forced cheerfulness, pouring himself a cup with the desperate gratitude of someone who needed caffeine to face challenging logistics. "Your flight doesn't leave until 10, right?" We should probably head to the airport around 8 to give ourselves plenty of time. The presumption that we would be handling her airport departure was characteristic of Marcus's continued difficulty accepting that Dot was capable of managing her own arrangements. She had hired a car service precisely to avoid the emotional complexity of family farewells at Sky Harbor, but he seemed unable to imagine her navigating travel logistics independently. "Actually, my car arrives at 7:30, Dot replied, checking her phone for the driver's confirmation message. "I prefer to handle airports without the emotional weight of family goodbyes." Marcus's face fell with the disappointment of someone who had been planning a gesture of support that wasn't wanted or needed. "But we wanted to see you off properly. The kids are excited about saying goodbye at the airport." "The kids are excited about the novelty of airport adventure," Dot corrected gently. "They're 4 years old. They'll forget about my departure 30 minutes after I'm gone and focus on whatever activity you provide to distract them from the schedule disruption." The practical assessment of childhood attention spans wasn't meant to be harsh, but it highlighted the difference between genuine emotional needs and adult projections about what departures should look like. Dot had learned to distinguish between family traditions that served real purposes and those that existed primarily to make adults feel better about uncomfortable transitions. At 6:30, Stephanie appeared with both twins, all three of them dressed in coordinated outfits that suggested she had been planning this departure scene for days. The twins carried handmade cards decorated with crayon drawings of ships and stick figures that were clearly meant to represent Grandma Dot's cruise adventure. "We made you going-away presents," Lily announced, thrusting her artwork toward Dot with the generous enthusiasm that made 4-year-olds such delightful gift givers. "This is you on the big boat, and this is all the fish you're going to see." Dot accepted the cards with genuine warmth, touched by the children's artistic efforts, even as she recognized Stephanie's orchestration of this emotional moment. The gifts were sweet, but they were also performance pieces designed to demonstrate family love and support, in ways that might somehow influence Dot's travel plans or future availability. "These are beautiful," Dot said, kneeling to embrace each twin properly. "I'll keep them in my cabin so I can look at them every day and remember how much I love you both. Will you bring us presents from all the countries?" Mason asked with the practical interest of a child who understood that travel often resulted in tangible benefits for those left behind. "I'll bring you stories," Dot promised, which was both more honest and more valuable than the tourist trinkets he was probably expecting. "Stories about ancient cities and beautiful art, and all the interesting people I meet along the way." The exchange was interrupted by the arrival of her car service, announced by a discreet knock on the front door that signaled the end of her Phoenix life and the beginning of her Mediterranean adventure. The driver, a professional woman in her 50s who radiated the competent efficiency of someone accustomed to airport logistics, helped load Dot's luggage with respectful acknowledgement that this was an important journey. "Ready for your big adventure?" the driver asked warmly, apparently recognizing in Dot the kind of determined independence that she saw in many of her clients who were embarking on life-changing travel. "More than ready," Dot replied, surprising herself with how true that statement felt. 2 months ago, the idea of solo international travel had seemed daunting enough to require courage. Now it felt like the natural next step in reclaiming her autonomy. The family gathered on the front porch for final farewells that were both emotional and awkward, weighted with the unresolved tensions that 6 months of separation might heal or permanently solidify. Marcus hugged her with the desperate affection of someone who was still hoping this departure might be negotiable, while Stephanie's embrace carried the stiff formality of someone performing reconciliation rather than feeling it. "Call us when you get settled," Marcus said, his voice carrying the parental concern that had never quite adjusted to seeing his mother as an independent adult capable of managing international travel. "I'll send postcards," Dot replied, gently but firmly establishing that communication would be on her terms rather than their anxiety schedule. "But remember what I said about being unavailable for household consultations or emergency management." As the car pulled away from the house where she had lived for 28 years, Dot felt an unexpected lightness rather than the nostalgic sadness she had anticipated. Looking back through the rear window, she saw her family standing on the porch. Marcus with his arm around Stephanie, the twins waving enthusiastically, and felt genuine love mixed with relief at temporary escape from the complicated dynamics that had made her home feel less like sanctuary and more like unpaid employment. The flight to Barcelona was everything she had hoped international travel would be: smooth, comfortable, and filled with the kind of anticipatory excitement that came from approaching completely new experiences without anyone else's needs to consider. She read guidebooks about Catalonian architecture, practiced basic Spanish phrases, and felt her identity expanding beyond the narrow roles that had defined her for the past 4 years. Barcelona exceeded her expectations in every way. The ship was elegant without being ostentatious, her cabin was perfectly appointed for solo luxury, and her fellow passengers were the kind of educated, curious travelers who made interesting dinner companions and shore excursion partners. For the first time in years, she was surrounded by people who saw her as Dorothy Henderson, interesting woman, thoughtful conversationalist, adventurous traveler, rather than grandmother, babysitter, or household manager. The daily rhythm of cruise life was revelation. Wake up in a new port, explore ancient sites with expert guides, return to the ship for elegant meals and stimulating lectures about Mediterranean history and culture. No one needed her to pack lunches, coordinate schedules, or mediate family conflicts. Her time was entirely her own, to spend as she chose. 3 months into the cruise, while exploring the ruins of Ephesus in Turkey, Dot received a text message from Marcus that crystallized how much her family was learning from her absence. "Mom, I finally understand what you meant about being taken for granted. Stephanie and I have both gained so much respect for everything you were doing to keep our lives running smoothly. We miss you, but we're also proud of you for putting yourself first. Enjoy every moment of your adventure." The message was exactly what she had hoped to hear. Not pleas for early return or guilt about family struggles, but genuine recognition of her value and support for her independence. It suggested that 6 months of managing their own household might indeed teach Marcus and Stephanie to appreciate her contributions, rather than simply expect them. 6 months later, when Dot returned to Phoenix tanned, confident, and filled with stories from 20 countries, she found a family that had learned to function independently, while genuinely missing her presence rather than simply her services. The house was clean but lived in, the children were thriving under more involved parenting, and both Marcus and Stephanie had developed household management skills they had never needed to learn, while assuming Dot would handle everything. "Welcome home, Mom," Marcus said, embracing her at the airport with tears in his eyes. "We have so much to tell you about what we've learned while you were gone. And I have so much to tell you about what I've discovered about myself," Dot replied, understanding that her Mediterranean adventure had given her something even more valuable than travel memories. It had given her back her sense of herself as a complete person whose life had meaning beyond her usefulness to others. The cruise had been exactly what she needed: 6 months of pure selfishness that taught everyone involved the difference between love and dependency, between being valued and being taken for granted, between family support and family exploitation. Sometimes, the best way to teach people not to call you useless is to show them exactly how much they need you, and then show them how well you can live without needing them back. The Mediterranean had called, and she had answered. But more importantly, she had learned to answer the call of her own dreams, regardless of whether anyone else thought they were useful or not. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.